Hi everyone, today we are working with theme analysis using various methods, and we are going to be working with the book The Cat Who Went to Heaven by Elizabeth Coatsworth, winner of the Newbery Medal, which is the highest honor in American children's literature. And this book earned it. So once you see how carefully it is written, you will understand why. And I want to say something about this book before we get into it. So on the surface, it reads really easy. So the sentences are short, the vocab is not difficult, and you could sit down and finish it in an afternoon, not even like 30 minutes if you really concentrate. But here's the thing. So texts that are easy to read, they're not always easy to understand. The act of reading and the act of understanding are quite different. In fact, it's quite the most deceptively simple stories carry the most complicated ideas. The themes in this book, like what it is really saying about things like belonging, worth, and who gets to decide who matters, these are not obvious at all. That is actually why I chose this text for this class, and so it's quite easy to read, genuinely hard to analyze. And that gap between the two is exactly where we want to do the work. So just to give you a little bit of recap, because the story is a few pages long, I have gotten some snippets from the passage or from the text. And the story, just to give you a little bit of context, is set in ancient Japan. And there's a poor artist that has been chosen to paint this sacred image for this local temple. It is the most important commission of his life because he is quite poor, not well off. He needs the money. And living in his home, watching everything unfold, is a small 3-colored cat named Good Fortune, which you will be hearing quite frequently as I talk. And she sits quietly every day before the sacred image in the corner of the house. So as you can see, good fortune and quiet devotion. So she catches a sparrow, and then even though she's hungry, she lifts her paws and lets it go for free. Because usually cats, you're kind of used to seeing them be more aggressive or more on the hunt with certain animals. And yet at the end of the story, she is not the only animal included in that painting, and every other animal is there, but the cat is not. Why? And more importantly, what is the author trying to say with that? That is the kind of question that we will be kind of exploring. And so the text, I think in total runs on like 31 pages. And so hopefully we can follow this little A through F excerpts. And we're going to be referring back to them throughout. We will do this in 2 steps, basically. We're going to map out the comparison between Good Fortune and the cat and the other animals on a Venn diagram. And then we're gonna take what we find and build it into an analytical paragraph with evidence from the text. Okay? This is what a Venn diagram should look like, but for the sake of easily writing, I am gonna do it in this box. But let's say this is a circle, like I showed you below. So the left side is the other animals, and this one's both. This one is for good fortune, so the cat. Okay, and before we fill this in, I want to be clear about what kind of question we should be asking. So whenever we approach a text analytically, the question should never just be, what happens to each character? That is a plot summary. But the question we should kind of always be asking is, what role does the character play? Does the character play in the story's bigger argument. What does each one stand for? Okay. And that shift in how you ask the question is what separates a reader from an analyst. So let's start with the other animals. As the artist works on the painting, the author takes us through the story of each animal one by one. So this is kind of the list of animals that the artist kind of walks us through. So the snail once crawled onto the head of this figure in the painting to shield him from the sun with its own body. And the elephant is kind of believed to carry this like spirit of the same figure in the past life and threw itself off a cliff so that a group of starving travelers could eat and survive. And the horse carried the prince silently out of his palace in the middle of the night, and he gave everything up in search for the truth. And then there's also the deer, which offered itself to a hunter to save another pregnant doe, female deer, who was not even from its own little group, its herd. And then finally, the dog jumped willingly into a basket to face a temple full of demons. So in a place where a young girl who would have died. So now, if you look at all of these 5 stories together, something stands out to me. So in every single case, if you notice, they all gave up something, right? So the snail gave up its own safety, the elephant gave up its life, the horse gave up its master, the deer gave up its place in line, and then the dog gave up its freedom. And so none of them were asked to do these things, right? But they chose to do it. And that choice, that voluntary sacrifice for someone else, is exactly what tradition is built on, I think. So it's kind of what gets them recognized, and it's what gets them included in the story. And it's what gives them this blessing. And so if we go back to the Venn diagram, so in the left circle, I would say the things that they have in common, included in the painting, recognized by tradition, and sacrificed something they have. And now let's look at the cat. She is the artist's cat. She lives in his home, and she sits in quiet devotion before the image every day. Head lowered, as you can remember from this part. Having found that she was unable to help either of them, sat quietly in the sun, ate as little as she could, often spent hours with lowered head, right? And then she slowly lifts both paws and lets the creature fly away, the sparrow. And then in passage D, when she sees a tiger, which is a ferocious predator, right, included in the painting, she looks up at the artist in like this quiet plea. If even the tiger belongs, she thinks surely a gentle white cat can also. And so she's doing everything right? So if we go back to our Venn diagram, sitting in quiet devotion daily, that is the first bullet point. We can also say excluded by tradition, not because of her own actions. And what else? Receives no blessing. So what I mean by that is not included in the painting. Now, we kind of have to look at the middle, what they both kind of share. And so think about what is actually happening in the story. So we clearly didn't have time to read through everything, but basically every day the artist is kind of sitting, pondering upon like what he should add to the painting, thinking very slowly, and trying to imagine each animal's story here, each animal's story here, trying to paint a picture in his head before he actually paints it. And good fortune there is there the whole time he's doing all of this, like imagining these stories. Good fortune is sitting behind him, watching every brushstroke be put onto the canvas. So in a way, all of these animals, the ones in the painting and the one watching it being made, they are kind of all gathered in one same space, right? Although not physically, I think it is there mentally. I would say that maybe both of them are drawn towards something larger than themselves. For the both section, maybe we can say something like drawn towards something larger than themselves, gathered around the act together, same space mentally. That was kind of step one, okay? We have the Venn diagram. But the honest truth is, if this is where your analysis stops, if filling in these circles is the deepest that you go for any text that you read, then all you have done is kind of describe the story, right? It's more of a description rather than an analysis. You've applied a little bit of analytical thinking, but not too deeply. Think of the Venn diagram more so as a tool, like a thinking tool, rather than an answer. And it's where the analysis starts. Now, the reason we need to push past description and ask what this contrast actually means. So the Venn diagram kind of shows you something that is different, but it doesn't tell you why that difference matters. Or it's not telling you what the author is trying to argue through it. Because you know these things happened, but for the artist to say these things, to implement these elements into the story, you don't really know why yet, right? Because the analysis has not occurred yet. We ask, why does this contrast matter? Naturally, right? These kind of questions arise. What is the author trying to say through it? And so let's actually kind of slow down and pull it apart. So listen or read carefully to how the artist phrases the exclusion when he explains it to good fortune, which is in passage C. All people know that cats, though lovely, are usually proud and self-satisfied. Alone among the animals, the cat refused to accept the teachings. She alone, of all creatures, was not blessed by him, right? The artist says the cat refused, right? Refused, that word in itself, it is a very deliberate choice. It's a very deliberate act. But if we look at what good fortune was doing earlier, we kind of spent step one earlier for what she was actually doing. What was she doing? She was just sitting in devotion every day. She even released a sparrow that she could have eaten. She mourns when she's told that she's not going to be included in the painting. And I think the natural question to ask is, does any of that kind of look like pride or disobedience? Where does this word refused come from, right? The artist does not say, I think cats are proud, or you, good fortune, have done something wrong. He says, all people knew, all people know, right? So he's repeating something that he was told in a way, something that was already decided by people who are not in that room, in that moment, about a whole category of a creature, long before this cat even existed. What an assumption, right? And that is a very different thing. Once you see that distinction, the whole passage kind of shifts. It stops being about good fortune's character, and it actually starts being more about how traditions work, right? They make rules for groups, and those rules stick regardless of what any individual in the group actually does. Now, look at passage B again. He saw good fortune, hesitate, and then slowly lift first one up, one white paw, and then another from the sparrow. Unhurt, in a loud whir of wings, the bird flew away. The author writes that the good fortune hesitated, right? And then slowly lifts one paw. She's hungry. Think about what that hesitation means, right? It's not that she does not want the bird, right? She's taking her time to think through her decision. She does want it. She catches it, but then she stops. She makes a choice in that moment to putting bird's life above her own hunger. To me, I think that's what mercy, this is what mercy looks like. And so it's not a grand gesture, right? It's not a sacrifice in a legend, but it's rather a quiet decision that's been made by a hungry cat in a poor household. Let's not try to fluff up the story, but that's just simply it, right? And that is actually the same thing that the other animals did. Remember this part with a list of what all the other animals sacrificed? And the only difference is that their version has a story attached to it. A story that the tradition remembers, right? Hers is a day-to-day mundane happening in her life, right? Not part of a particular story that the artist was trying to paint, because she herself is not in that story, not in the original story. The contrast the author has built is not actually between a compassionate cat and cruel or indifferent animals. They're all one in their own way, practicing the same thing. The contrast between who gets recognized for it and who does not is it. That is the contrast. And that is what makes the exclusion of the cat so uncomfortable to sit with. And that is the author's argument. So belonging, being accepted, and recognized. It's not always about who you actually are. It is about who the tradition says you are. I think this is a much more interesting idea, right? Rather than saying, the cat is sad. It's way too simple, right? For what the actual story is trying to tell. Let's try to write this. So a strong analytical paragraph does three things. So it makes a claim, bring in evidence, so the quote, and then explain what the evidence means. And the third step is where a lot of the work goes missing. People often kind of skip that one. So remember the contrast that we built on the Venn diagram here. The contrast the author has built is about who gets recognized for their sacrifice and who does not. It is not about who you actually are, but who the tradition says you are. And so step one, the argument we pulled out of it. In step two, the animals are recognized and blessed because tradition says that they belong. And then good fortune is excluded, even though her actions in the story shows that she is just as devoted. Maybe this is a basic claim that we could use. Coatsworth uses good fortune's exclusion to suggest that belonging is determined by tradition rather than individual worth. That is our argument. Now, what we need is a quote that supports it. And we are going to use passage C. We're going to use this. And the same passage we examined in step two, where the artist explains exclusion to good fortune directly. So most students, when we are trying to embed the quote, write something like, so weaker summary and integration. So when the artist tells good fortune that alone among the animals, the cat refused to accept the teachings, he is not describing her. He is reciting a rule she had no part in making. And so let's kind of look at why this one works. The student version just drops the quote in and then labels what it shows, right? But the integration version, it does something different. It uses the word reciting. And why does that word matter? So think about the difference between saying something and reciting something. So when you say something, it comes to you, right? And you are reproducing words that already exist or that don't exist. Whereas when you're reciting something, you are reproducing words that already exist. And so words that kind of belong to something that may be like larger than you, like it could be a script, it could be a law, it could be a tradition, like the theme of the story. By choosing reciting instead of anything else, what are we trying to say? So we could have used easily like saying or telling, but this person did not decide it. So they're simply passing it along, right? And I think that is a very meaningful distinction to make because it tells us that the exclusion is not personal, it is structural. So the artist is not being cruel necessarily. He is a product of the tradition, right? That is actually a harder problem to solve than cruelty because there is no one single person to blame. You can't really like point a finger at someone. I mean, you could, but it wouldn't really be justified, right? We want to extend from what we had written here, right? So here is kind of like an extended version. This one I'm not going to talk too much about because it's just like a combination of everything that we have talked about, but just to kind of explain through it, this is a complete analytical version. So claim, and then evidence, and then interpretation. So we use the step 1 to find the contrast, and then and then we use the question saying, okay, so what? And then in step 2, we ask the question, so what? After finding the contrast, right? We had made the contrast with the Venn diagram, and then we spot the contrast, and with that spotted contrast, we ask the question, so what? And then in step 3, the paragraph proves it with evidence. Each step builds directly on one before it. Let's kind of zoom out, recap everything that we've went over. We started with the Venn diagram. This is the observational level, right? We notice a contrast, and then we ask, so what? And then we arrived at a theme, right? And that is the interpretation level. And then we built on a paragraph that earns that interpretation through specific evidence. That is the analysis level. And then observation, interpretation, analysis, that 3-step move is the core of everything we practice in class. Whether you are writing a short response, a timed essay, a full literary commentary. And so one last thing to sit with is the miracle ending. Okay? Last animal had stood was now only white silk that seemed never to have felt the touch of ink. And this figure stretched out an arm in blessing, and under the holy hand knelt the figure of a tiny cat with a pretty white head. So this happens after the priest takes the painting away. So something has changed overnight. So the artist ended up painting the cat, and the cat has vanished from the silk. So that's kind of the canvas that it was being drawn on. And the figure in the painting stretched out his hand and gave the cat his blessing. And so if the story's theme is about unjust exclusion, why does the author end it this way? Does the miracle actually fix the problem, or just paper over it? And I think this is just a fun little question to ponder upon. And that is exactly the kind of question that we learn to love and answer well. That is it. Thank you.